The hangar sat at the edge of Whitefish, Montana, slowly being reclaimed by rust and wild grass. Most people in town had forgotten it was even there, just another relic of the past, hidden behind a stand of lodgepole pines with the Rocky Mountains rising in the distance. Inside, beneath a tarp gray with dust and bird droppings, sat a 1978 Cessna 185 Skywagon. Once it had been the pride of the region, a workhorse that carried supplies, medicines, and hope to ranches and villages scattered across Montana's impossible terrain. Now it was a tomb, silent and still, holding 25 years of grief. Robert "Bobby" Caldwell stood at the entrance of the hangar, as he did every morning, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He was 58 years old, though his weathered face and the deep lines around his eyes made him look older. His hair was completely gray, cut short and practical. His hands, pilot's hands, steady and sure, trembled slightly as he stared at the covered aircraft. He never went inside, never touched the tarp, never opened the door of the plane. That was the promise he'd made 25 years ago, standing in this exact spot with his wife's funeral program still folded in his pocket. Never again. Never the sky. Never. "Morning, Bobby." The voice startled him from his reverie. Frank Morrison, who ran the small regional airstrip just outside town, walked up the gravel path with his own coffee. Frank was younger, maybe 45, and still flew regularly, taking supplies to remote ranches and fire lookout stations in the Bob Marshall wilderness. "Morning," Bobby replied, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't talk much these days. "You know," Frank said, not for the first time, "I could help you sell that plane, get you some money." "It's just sitting there, Bobby. 25 years. "I know how long it's been," Bobby said quietly. Frank sighed. They'd had this conversation before. "Look, I'm not trying to push, but the market's good right now for restored bush planes. That Skywagon, even in rough shape, could fetch 40, maybe 50 grand. There's guys who'd restore her, get her flying again. It's not for sale." The finality in Bobby's tone ended the conversation. Frank nodded, squeezed Bobby's shoulder and walked away. Bobby heard his footsteps fade, replaced by the sound of small planes taking off from the nearby airstrip. That familiar roar of engines, the sensation of lift, the freedom of air beneath wings. Bobby turned away. He couldn't listen to it. He walked back to his house, a small cabin half a mile from the hangar, tucked into the trees with a view of Whitefish Lake. It was neat, sparse, functional. No photos on the walls. No memories displayed. Just the essentials of a man who'd spent 25 years trying to forget. His work kept him occupied. Bobby ran a small engine repair shop in town, fixing tractor engines, generators, snowmobile motors, anything mechanical. His hands knew machines the way some people knew music. It was honest work, quiet work, and it kept his mind from wandering to places he couldn't go. Around noon, Sarah Chen stopped by the shop with a generator that was giving her trouble. Sarah was 32, ran a wilderness guide service, and was one of the few people in town Bobby considered a friend. "She's not holding a charge," Sarah explained, gesturing to the generator. "Thought maybe it's the alternator." Bobby examined the machine with practiced ease. "Alternator's fine. You've got corrosion on your battery terminals. See here?" He pointed to the white buildup. "Moisture got in somehow. Shall clean them and test the battery. Shouldn't take more than an hour." "Thanks, Bobby. You're a lifesaver." The word made him flinch, but Sarah didn't notice. She leaned against the workbench, watching him work. "You hear about the Mallory kid?" Bobby shook his head, focused on cleaning the terminals. "Emma Mallory, 9 years old, lives up in Timber Creek with her parents. You know that place? Up near the wilderness boundary, about 80 miles north. Just 3 families living year-round up there. She's got some kind of infection. Started as a cut on her foot, now it's sepsis. They radioed for a medevac helicopter, but there's a massive storm system moving in from Canada. No chopper can fly in these conditions." Bobby's hands paused for just a moment, then continued working. "Life flight? Weather's too dangerous even for them. Wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. Zero visibility with the snow. They're saying maybe tomorrow morning if the storm clears, but..." Sarah trailed off and Bobby could hear the unspoken truth. Tomorrow might be too late. "Her parents must be terrified," Sarah continued. "Can you imagine? Your kid dying and you can't do anything about it because you're stuck in the middle of nowhere. No roads in or out this time of year. Everything's snowed in. Just that old radio and hope." Bobby could imagine. He imagined it every day. He finished cleaning the terminals in silence, tested the generator, it ran smooth. and handed Sarah the bill. She paid him, thanked him, and left. Bobby closed the shop early. He did that sometimes when memories pressed too close. He walked through town, past the grocery store, past the small medical clinic, past the elementary school where children were playing in the snow during recess. He found himself at the cemetery on the south edge of town. He didn't come here often, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, but today his feet carried him here without conscious thought. 3 headstones, side by side, under a large ponderosa pine. Margaret Rose Caldwell, beloved wife and mother, 1962, 1999. Catherine Katie Caldwell, our angel, 1990, 1999. Michael James Caldwell, forever in our hearts, 1993, 1999. 25 years, 2 months, and 14 days ago. Bobby stood there for a long time, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, breath misting in the cold Montana air. The sky above was that particular shade of gray that meant snow was coming. Heavy, winter snow that would blanket everything and make the world quiet and still. "Storm coming," he said aloud to the graves, his voice barely above a whisper. "Big one, they say." The wind picked up, rustling through the pine needles. Bobby closed his eyes and he was there again. December 15th, 1999. The weather report had said light snow, manageable. He'd flown in worse. Margaret, Katie, and Michael were coming back from visiting Margaret's sister in Great Falls. Bobby had a supply run scheduled, so he'd gone ahead earlier in the day. The plan was for them to meet him at the Timber Creek airstrip, but the weather had turned faster than predicted. What was supposed to be light snow became a blizzard. Margaret had radioed him, her voice calm but concerned. "Bobby, visibility's getting bad. Should we turn back?" He'd checked his instruments, looked at the sky. He was the experienced pilot. He'd been flying these mountains for 15 years. He'd made the call. "We're fine, Maggie. Just another 20 minutes. I can see the airstrip lights from here." Those were the last words he ever said to his wife. They'd been 7 minutes out when they hit the downdraft. Mountain wave turbulence, sudden and violent. The plane had pitched, stalled. Margaret had tried to recover. She was a competent pilot, had her license. But the weather, the mountains, the wind. They'd found the wreckage 3 days later, half buried in snow on the side of Cathedral Peak. The investigators said it was quick, that they probably didn't suffer. Bobby didn't believe them. He opened his eyes, staring at the headstones. "There's a kid up in Timber Creek," he said to the silence. 9 years old, sick. Storm's coming and nobody can fly her out." The graves offered no response. They never did. Bobby turned and walked away, heading back toward his cabin. The first snowflakes were beginning to fall, large, heavy flakes that meant the storm was here. By the time he reached home, the snow was falling steadily. Bobby made himself dinner, canned soup and bread, and sat by the window watching the storm intensify. The radio on his kitchen counter was tuned to the emergency frequency, something he'd never quite been able to stop doing, even after all these years. At 7:47 p.m., the radio crackled to life. "This is Timber Creek, calling any available aircraft. We have a medical emergency. 9-year-old female, septic shock, needs immediate evacuation to Kalispell Regional Medical Center. Repeat, this is a medical emergency. Is anyone receiving? Static. Timber Creek calling any aircraft. Please respond, we have a child dying. Please, is anyone out there?" Bobby's hand moved to the radio, then stopped. He stared at it, his heart pounding. Another voice came through, dispatch from the regional airstrip. "Timber Creek, this is Whitefish Dispatch. We copy your emergency. Be advised all aircraft are grounded due to weather conditions. Storm system showing wind gusts 55-60 mph with 0 visibility. Life flight cannot safely operate. Can you hold until morning?" A different voice now, a woman's, breaking with desperation. "This is Janet Mallory, that's my daughter. Please, she doesn't have until morning. The fever's at 104, she's barely conscious. Please, somebody help us." "Mom, I understand. We're doing everything we can. The weather—" "I don't care about the weather." Janet Mallory's voice was raw with fear and anguish. "My baby is dying. Please." Bobby stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window and looked out at the storm. Snow was coming down so thick he could barely see 20 feet. The wind was howling through the trees, bending the pines at dangerous angles. No one could fly in this. It would be suicide. He thought about Emma Mallory, 9 years old, burning with fever in some remote cabin 80 miles away. He thought about her mother's voice. breaking with the same desperation he'd heard in his own voice 25 years ago when he'd screamed at the search and rescue teams to find his family. He thought about Katie, his daughter, who'd been 9 years old when she died, who'd probably been scared in those final moments before the plane hit the mountain. Bobby's hands were shaking. He looked at the hangar, barely visible through the snow. Inside was a plane that hadn't flown in 25 years, a plane he'd sworn never to touch again. The radio crackled again. "Please," Janet Mallory sobbed. "Please, someone. Anyone." Bobby closed his eyes. Never again. Never the sky. Never. That was the promise. But what was a promise worth when a child was dying? Bobby opened his eyes and looked at his hands. They were still shaking, but not from fear. From something else. Something he'd buried for 25 years. Purpose. He grabbed his jacket, his boots, and walked out into the storm. The walk to the hangar took 15 minutes through knee-deep snow. Bobby's flashlight beam barely penetrated the white chaos swirling around him. The wind cut through his jacket like knives, and his face was already numb by the time he reached the hangar doors. His hands fumbled with the padlock. How long since he'd opened this? Years. Maybe a decade. The key was on his keychain, always there, a weight he carried but never used. The lock opened with a rusty click. Bobby pulled the sliding door open. It resisted, scraping against accumulated debris and ice, but finally gave way. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, shutting out the howl of the storm. The silence in the hangar was profound, almost sacred. Bobby's flashlight swept across the space, illuminating decades of stillness, tool benches covered in dust, spare parts on shelves, and in the center that grey tarp covering the shape he knew by heart. Bobby approached slowly, as if the plane might disappear if he moved too fast. His hand reached out and touched the tarp. The fabric was brittle, rotted in places. He grabbed a corner and pulled. The tarp came away in a cloud of dust that made him cough. And there she was, N4729B, his Cessna 185 Skywagon. She looked like a ghost. The blue and white paint was faded, streaked with rust. The windshield was covered in grime. One tire was completely flat. 25 years of neglect showed in every inch. But underneath the decay, Bobby could still see the beautiful machine she'd once been. His hands moved over her fuselage, checking panels, testing surfaces. The memories came flooding back. Every flight, every landing, every moment of freedom he'd felt up there. He opened the pilot's door. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the cockpit smelled of mildew and old leather. The seats were cracked and stained. Rodents had nested in the back, but the instrument panel was intact, the controls still there, and taped to the dashboard, exactly where he'd left it 25 years ago, was a photograph. Katie, his daughter, smiling at the camera, missing her 2 front teeth, wearing her co-pilot t-shirt that was 3 sizes too big. She'd loved flying with him. Every chance she got, she'd beg to go up. "Daddy, can we see the Eagles today? Daddy, can we do a barrel roll? Daddy, when I grow up, I'm going to be a pilot just like you." Bobby's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry, Katie Bug," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." He forced himself to focus. If he was really going to do this, and God help him he was, then he needed to assess whether this plane could even fly. Bobby spent the next hour conducting an inspection that would have horrified any aviation safety inspector. He checked the engine oil, black and thick with age. The fuel tanks, empty, thank God, or the fuel would have turned to varnish. The propeller, one blade had a small crack. The tires, 2 were flat, 1 was dry-rotted. The battery, completely dead. But the airframe was sound. The engine, though old, wasn't seized. With work, she could fly again. Bobby looked at his watch, 8:53 p.m. Emma Mallory didn't have time for a proper restoration. She needed help now. He pulled out his phone and called Frank Morrison. Frank answered on the 3rd ring, sounding half asleep. "Bobby, it's almost 9 o'clock. What? I need your help," Bobby said, "and I need it now." There was a pause. "What's wrong?" "The Mallory kid. I'm going to fly her out." Silence. Then, "Bobby, have you looked outside? Nobody's flying tonight. I know what it is. I need you to bring me fresh oil, a battery, an air pump, and 10 gallons of avgas. Can you do that? Bobby, you haven't flown in 25 years, and that plane—" "Frank," Bobby's voice was steel. "Can you do it or not?" Another pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Bobby spent the waiting time clearing debris from the hangar and checking flight surfaces. The ailerons were stiff but moved. The rudder needed lubrication but functioned. The flaps, he'd have to test those after engine start. True to his word, Frank arrived 23 minutes later, pulling up in his truck with headlights cutting through the snow. He had everything Bobby requested, plus a worried expression. "You're serious about this," Frank said as they hauled supplies into the hangar. "As a heart attack. Bobby, even if you get this bird running, the weather is deadly. Zero visibility, 60-mile-per-hour gusts, and you'd have to thread the needle between mountains in the dark. It's suicide." Bobby was already changing the oil, his hands moving with muscle memory he thought he'd lost. "That kid doesn't have until morning. And if you crash, then there's 2 tragedies instead of 1. Bobby looked up at him. "Then there's 2. But at least I tried." Frank stared at his friend for a long moment. Then he set down the battery and picked up a wrench. "Okay, let's get her running." They worked together in focused silence. Frank installed the new battery while Bobby finished the oil change. They inflated the tires. 2 held air, 1 had to be patched. Bobby tested the avionics and was surprised when several instruments flickered to life. The radio worked. The altimeter worked. The attitude indicator was dead. But Bobby had flown for years before glass cockpits. He could fly by feel if he had to. At 10:17 p.m., Bobby climbed into the pilot's seat for the first time in 25 years. His hands gripped the yoke, and the sensation was so familiar, so right, that it hurt. "Ready?" Frank asked from outside. Bobby nodded. He primed the engine, set the mixture rich, and turned the key. The starter motor whined. The propeller turned once, twice, then stopped. "Come on," Bobby muttered. "Come on, girl." He tried again. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then, incredibly, roared to life. The sound was deafening in the enclosed hangar. Blue smoke poured from the exhaust. The whole plane shook like it might tear itself apart. But she was running. Bobby let the engine warm up, checking gauges, listening for problems. The oil pressure climbed into the green. The engine temperature rose, the RPM steadied. He looked at Frank, who was staring in disbelief. "She's running!" Frank shouted over the noise. "She's running!" Bobby confirmed. He throttled down and the engine settled into a rough but steady idle. Bobby ran through the rest of his checks. Flaps, working, barely. Fuel. He'd need to fill up. Lights. The landing light worked. 1 navigation light was out. It wasn't safe. It wasn't legal. It was barely functional. But it would have to be enough. Bobby shut down the engine and climbed out. "Help me tow her out and fuel her up. I need to file a flight plan and get weather updates." "Bobby," Frank said seriously, "I can't let you do this. You can't stop me. I can report you to the FAA. Your license is expired. This plane hasn't had an annual inspection in 2.5 decades. You'd be flying into one of the worst storms we've had in years." Bobby looked his friend in the eye. "Then report me. But do it after I take off." Frank ran a hand through his hair, conflicted. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Bobby didn't answer immediately. He looked at Katie's photo still taped to the dashboard, then back at Frank. "Because 25 years ago, I made a call that killed my family. Because I've spent every day since then wondering if I could have done something different. And because right now, tonight, there's a 9-year-old girl who's going to die unless someone does something." His voice broke slightly. "I can't save Katie. But maybe I can save Emma." Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay, let's get her fueled up. And Bobby, I'm coming with you." "No." "Yes. You need a co-pilot, and you know it. You haven't flown in 25 years. Your instruments are half dead. Someone needs to work the radio, navigate, help you make decisions. That's me." Bobby wanted to argue, but Frank was right. And truth be told, he was terrified of doing this alone. "Okay," Bobby said. "Let's move." They hooked up the tow bar and pulled the Cessna out into the storm. The wind immediately grabbed at the wings, trying to flip the plane. They had to use tie-downs just to keep her stable while they fueled. Bobby called dispatch on his phone, fighting to be heard over the wind. "This is Robert Caldwell. I'm filing an emergency VFR flight plan from Whitefish to Timber Creek. Mr. Caldwell, all aircraft are grounded. Weather conditions. I'm aware of the conditions. Log my flight plan. I'm taking off in 10 minutes whether you approve it or not." The dispatcher was silent for a moment. "Sir, I need your registration number and N4729B, Cessna 185, ETA Timber Creek, 45 minutes. I'm carrying 1 passenger and evacuating a miner with medical emergency to Kalispell Regional. Sir, I'm showing that registration hasn't filed a flight plan since 1999. The aircraft is... I said log it. 10 minutes. Caldwell out. He hung up before they could argue further. Frank had finished fueling. 90 gallons should be more than enough for Timber Creek and back to Kalispell. Bobby nodded. He climbed into the pilot's seat, and Frank took the right seat. They buckled in, and Bobby's hands moved through the pre-flight checklist from memory. Weather report? Bobby asked. Frank checked his phone. Surface winds gusting to 50-18 mph. Visibility less than a quarter mile. Ceiling at 500 feet. Bobby, this is... I know what it is. Get Timber Creek on the radio. Let them know we're coming. Frank keyed the radio. Timber Creek, this is Cessna N4729B. We're inbound for medical evacuation. ETA 45 minutes. Please advise field conditions. Static. Then a voice. A man's filled with disbelief. 4729B, did you say you're coming? In this weather? Affirmative. We need runway lights if you have them, and a vehicle with headlights pointing down the strip. Can you do that? Yes. Yes, we can do that. Oh my God, thank you, thank you. Bobby started the engine. It caught on the first try this time, settling into that rough but steady rhythm. He ran through the engine checks, magnetos, both working. Carburetor heat, functional. Controls free and correct. He looked at Frank. Last chance to change your mind. Frank shook his head. Let's go save that kid. Bobby released the parking brake and added power. The plane lurched forward, crawling through the deep snow toward the taxiway. The storm battered them from all sides. Bobby could barely see 50 feet in front of the plane. This was insane. This was impossible. This was exactly what he needed to do. They reached the runway threshold. Bobby lined up, checking his instruments one last time. Everything that could work was working. Everything else he'd have to compensate for. He thought about Margaret, Katie, and Michael. He thought about the promise he'd made. I'm sorry, he whispered, but I have to break it. He pushed the throttle to full power. The engine roared, the plane shook, and slowly, painfully, they began to roll forward into the darkness and the storm. The Cessna accelerated down the snow-covered runway, the visibility so poor that Bobby flew by instruments and instinct rather than sight. The airspeed indicator climbed. 40 knots, 50 knots, 60 knots. At 65 knots, Bobby pulled back on the yoke. The wheels left the ground, and for the first time in 25 years, Robert Caldwell was flying. The sensation hit him like a physical blow. Not fear, though there was plenty of that, but an overwhelming rush of memory and emotion. His hands knew what to do. His body remembered the feel of the controls, the language the plane spoke through vibrations and sounds. But the storm was immediate and vicious. The moment they cleared the runway, a crosswind gust slammed into them from the right, banking the plane 30 degrees. Bobby corrected instinctively, fighting the controls, bringing the wings level. Jesus, Frank gasped, gripping his seat. It's okay, Bobby said, though his knuckles were white on the yoke. Just turbulence. Just turbulence? Bobby, we're getting thrown around like... Another gust hit them, this time from below, an updraft that sent them climbing 200 feet in seconds. Bobby's stomach dropped as they were lifted, then plummeted just as quickly when the wind died. He kept his eyes on the instruments. Airspeed holding at 85 knots, altitude 1 to 200 feet and climbing, heading 340 degrees, north-northwest toward Timber Creek. The problem was that between Whitefish and Timber Creek lay the Mission Mountains, peaks reaching over 9,000 feet. In clear weather, Bobby would have simply climbed over them. But tonight, with zero visibility and an underpowered plane, he'd have to thread the valley passes at low altitude. In a blizzard, in the dark, in a plane he hadn't flown in 25 years. Frank, I need you to call out landmarks as we pass them. Use the GPS on your phone if you have to. Frank was already on it, his phone pressed against the window despite the fact that he could see absolutely nothing outside. We're heading up the valley toward Echo Lake. Should hit the lake in about 7 minutes. Roger that. The next 7 minutes were the longest of Bobby's life. The plane bucked and shuddered in the turbulence. Snow and ice pelted the windshield so hard it sounded like machine gun fire. The visibility was literally zero. Bobby couldn't even see the wingtips. He flew entirely by instruments, trusting in numbers and needles and his own muscle memory. Attitude indicator was dead, so he watched the altimeter and airspeed, feeling the plane's movements, making constant tiny corrections to keep her level and steady. Frank called out waypoints from his GPS. Echo Lake, now, turning to heading 355. Bobby adjusted course. They were entering the narrow part of the valley now, with mountains rising on either side. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. Massive walls of rock and ice, waiting to kill anyone foolish enough to fly this low in these conditions. "How are we on altitude?" Frank asked, his voice tight with stress. "Holding at 1,800 feet. Valley floor is at 1,200, peaks at 9,000. We've got room. If we're in the right valley." "We're in the right valley. How can you tell?" "You can't see anything." "I can feel it," Bobby said. And it was true. The way the wind hit them, the way the plane responded, the subtle changes in pressure. His body remembered this flight path. He'd flown it hundreds of times before the accident. 20 minutes into the flight, disaster struck. A massive downdraft slammed into them from above. Mountain wave turbulence, the same phenomenon that had killed his family. The plane dropped like a stone, falling 300 feet in seconds. Warning alarms screamed. The stall indicator blared. Bobby pushed the throttle to full power and nosed down, trying to build airspeed, trying to maintain control. "Bobby!" Frank shouted. "I've got it!" But he didn't have it. The plane was falling too fast and the downdraft was too strong. 1,500 feet, 1,400 feet, 1,300 feet. The valley floor was at 1,200 feet. Bobby's mind flashed to that night 25 years ago. Margaret's voice on the radio. "Bobby, we're in trouble." The sound of the stall warning. The silence after the crash. "No!" Bobby roared. He yanked back on the yoke, adding full flaps, doing everything he could to arrest the descent. 1,250 feet. They broke out of the downdraft. The plane shuddered, groaned, but held together. Bobby leveled off at 1,300 feet and reduced power, his heart hammering in his chest. Are we okay?" Frank asked, his voice shaking. "We're okay," Bobby said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. They flew on in tense silence. Bobby made constant corrections, fighting the wind, working harder than he'd ever worked to keep them in the air. His arms ached. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold, but he kept flying. 35 minutes into the flight, Frank's phone GPS showed they were approaching Timber Creek. "Should be 5 miles out," Frank reported. "Bobby, how are you going to land in this? You can't see anything." Bobby had been thinking about that. They said they'd put vehicle headlights on the runway. "We find those lights, we follow them down." "And if we don't find them?" Bobby didn't answer. He began his descent, bringing them down from 1,800 feet slowly, carefully. 1,700, 1,600, 1,500. "Timber Creek, this is N4729B, Frank called on the radio. "We're inbound, approximately 2 miles out. Do you have runway lights?" "Affirmative, 4729B. We have 3 vehicles with headlights pointing north down the strip. Wind is out of the north at 45, gusting to 60. You're going to have a hell of a headwind on final." "Copy that." 1,400 feet, 1,300 feet. "Bobby, I don't see anything," Frank said. "Keep looking." 1,200 feet, 1,100 feet. They were getting too low. If they didn't spot the lights soon, Bobby would have to climb back up and try again. But would Emma Mallory have time for another attempt? "There!" Frank suddenly shouted. 2 o'clock lights!" Bobby looked. Through the swirling snow, he could just barely make out 3 points of light in a line. Vehicle headlights. "I see them." He turned toward the lights, lining up what he hoped was the runway. The wind was pushing them sideways. Bobby crabbed the plane into the wind, nose pointed left of the runway to compensate for the drift. 500 feet, 400 feet. The lights grew brighter. Bobby could see them clearly now. 3 pickup trucks parked along what had to be the runway, their headlights creating a path through the storm. 300 feet, 200 feet. "Flaps full," Bobby called out, dropping the final notch. The plane slowed, dropping faster now. 100 feet. Bobby could see the ground now, white, rushing up at them too fast. He pulled back on the throttle, flared the nose up, fighting the wind that was trying to slam them down. 50 feet. 25 feet. The wheels touched with a jarring impact. Bobby immediately applied brakes, but the runway was covered in deep snow. They slid, the plane skidding sideways. Come on," Bobby muttered, working the rudder pedals, trying to keep them straight. They slid past the first truck, past the second, finally coming to a stop just beyond the third. Bobby sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the yoke, breathing hard. "We made it," Frank said in disbelief. We actually made it. Bobby looked at him and managed a weak smile. Half made it. We still have to get back. Before either of them could say anything else, figures appeared out of the storm. People running toward the plane. Bobby opened his door and was immediately hit by the full force of the wind and snow. A man in a heavy parka reached them first. "You're the pilots? You actually came. Where's the girl?" Bobby shouted over the wind. "This way." They followed the man, Tom Mallory, Emma's father, through the storm to the nearest house. Inside, the warmth hit Bobby like a wall. A woman, Janet Mallory, was kneeling beside a makeshift bed where a small figure lay under piles of blankets. Emma Mallory. She was unconscious, her face pale and slick with sweat despite the fever. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. "How long has she been out?" Bobby asked, kneeling beside her. "About 30 minutes, Janet said, her voice breaking. "Please, you have to help her, please." Bobby looked at the girl and saw Katie. Same age, same brown hair, same fragile vulnerability. "We're getting her out of here," Bobby said firmly. "Frank, help me carry her. We need to move fast." They wrapped Emma in the blankets and Bobby lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. Tom and Janet grabbed emergency supplies, medication, water, warm clothes. "I'm coming with you," Janet said. "Ma'am, it's going to be a rough flight." "I don't care, that's my daughter." Bobby looked at the terror and determination in her eyes. He remembered that feeling, wanting to protect your child, to be there no matter what. "Okay, let's move." They ran back out into the storm. Getting Emma into the plane was a challenge. Bobby laid her across the back seats while Janet climbed in beside her. Tom stayed on the ground, his face a mask of hope and fear. "Bring her back," he called out. "I will," Bobby promised. He and Frank climbed back into the cockpit. Bobby ran through a quick pre-flight check, then started the engine. It caught immediately this time, as if the plane knew what was at stake. "Kalispell Regional is 50 miles south," Frank said, checking his phone. 25 minutes in good weather." Bobby looked at the storm raging around them. "Nothing about this is good weather, but we're doing it anyway." He released the brakes and added power. The plane began to roll forward through the snow, picking up speed. 40 knots, 50 knots, 60 knots. Bobby pulled back, and they lifted off into the storm. The return flight had just begun, and the worst was yet to come. The ascent from Timber Creek was brutal. With Emma's added weight and the headwind, the Cessna climbed sluggishly. Bobby fought for every foot of altitude. From the back, Janet Mallory's voice cut through the engine noise. "She's burning up. Her fever's getting worse." Bobby glanced back. Emma was still unconscious, her small body trembling despite the blankets. Janet held her daughter close, tears streaming down her face. "How long to the hospital?" Janet asked desperately. Frank checked his GPS. 23 minutes if we maintain this speed." "She doesn't have 23 minutes, Janet cried. Bobby knew she was right. He could hear it in Emma's breathing, that wet, rattling sound that meant her lungs were filling with fluid. Septic shock was shutting down her organs. He pushed the throttle forward, coaxing more speed from the ancient engine. The plane shook violently, protesting the abuse, but accelerated. "Bobby, you're redlining the engine," Frank warned. "I know." The storm wasn't letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. Visibility was zero, turbulence constant and vicious. Bobby flew by pure instinct, his hands moving automatically to counter every gust, every downdraft. 10 minutes into the flight, the engine coughed. Bobby's blood went cold. He checked the fuel gauge, still showing half full. Oil pressure was good, but the engine coughed again, stuttering. "What was that?" Frank asked, fear in his voice. "Ice," Bobby said grimly. "Carburetor ice. The moisture in this storm is freezing in the intake." He pulled the carburetor heat control, diverting hot air from the engine to melt the ice. The engine smoothed out, but Bobby knew it was only temporary. In these conditions, ice would keep forming. "Bobby, we need to talk about emergency landing options," Frank said quietly. "No. If that engine quits, it won't quit." "You can't know that." Bobby's jaw set. "It won't quit, because I won't let it. That girl is not dying on my plane." From the back, Janet's voice. "She's not responding. Emma baby, wake up." Bobby looked at Katie's photo on the dashboard. His daughter smiled back at him, frozen forever, at 9 years old. "Not this time," Bobby whispered. "Not this time." He pushed the plane harder, faster, willing it to hold together just a little longer. 15 minutes from Kalispell, disaster struck again. The engine died. Complete silence, except for the howl of wind. The propeller windmilled uselessly. All the instruments that depended on engine power went dark. "Bobby!" Frank shouted. Bobby was already working the problem. He checked fuel, still showing half full, so not fuel starvation. He tried restarting. Nothing. The engine was flooded or locked up or no time to diagnose. They were gliding now, losing altitude fast. "Frank, get me vectors to the nearest flat ground." Frank's hands shook as he worked his phone. "There's nothing." "We're over, Forrest. Bobby, there's nowhere to land." In the back, Janet was praying, holding Emma tight. Bobby's mind raced. They were at 4,000 feet. In a glide, they could maybe cover 5 miles before hitting the ground. 5 miles through zero visibility, looking for a miracle. He thought about his family, about the crash that took them, about 25 years of guilt and grief. Was this how it ended? History repeating itself? "No," Bobby said aloud. He reached for the carburetor heat control and slammed it to full cold, then hit the starter. The engine caught, sputtered, coughed, but caught. "Yes!" Frank screamed. Bobby nursed the throttle, bringing the RPMs up slowly. The engine was running rough, missing every few revolutions, but it was running. "What did you do?" Frank asked in amazement. "Flooded engine from carburetor heat. Needed cold air to clear it." Bobby's hands were rock steady now, all fear gone, replaced by pure focus. "How far to Kalispell Regional?" 8 miles. "Bobby, you did it. You actually—" "We're not there yet." The next 8 miles were agony. The engine ran rough the entire time, threatening to quit at any moment. Bobby had to constantly adjust mixture and throttle, coaxing the dying machine forward. But through the storm, lights appeared. The glow of Kalispell, Montana. "Kalispell Regional, this is emergency flight N4729B, Frank called on the radio. "We have a critical patient, 9-year-old female with septic shock. Request immediate landing and medical team standing by." 4729B, Kalispell Regional, "We've been expecting you. You're cleared for emergency landing runway 25. Medical team is standing by. Wind 340 at 48, gusting to 62. Bobby lined up on the runway using the airport's approach lights. His arms ached from fighting the controls for the past hour, but he pushed through the pain. Final approach. The wind tried to kill them one last time, a massive gust that nearly flipped them inverted. Bobby fought it, won, and brought the plane down. The wheels touched. They were down. Before the plane fully stopped, an ambulance was racing alongside them. The moment Bobby cut the engine, paramedics swarmed the plane. They pulled Emma out, placed her on a gurney. Janet ran alongside, holding her daughter's hand. "Pulse is weak, blood pressure 70/40. She's in shock," one paramedic called out. They loaded Emma into the ambulance. Janet looked back at Bobby one time, mouthed, "Thank you," and then they were gone, sirens wailing into the night. Bobby sat in the cockpit, suddenly unable to move. The adrenaline that had kept him going drained away all at once, leaving him hollow and shaking. Frank put a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Bobby. You saved her." Bobby looked at his hands. They were trembling uncontrollably. 25 years since he'd flown. 25 years of guilt and grief. And tonight, he'd faced the storm again. "I broke my promise," Bobby said quietly. "Sometimes," Frank replied, "the right thing to do is break a promise." The hospital waiting room was sterile, fluorescent, nothing like the wild storm outside. Bobby and Frank sat in plastic chairs, soaked and exhausted, while nurses brought them coffee and blankets. "You should go home," Bobby told Frank. "Get some rest. I'll wait with you." An hour passed, then 2. Bobby stared at the white walls, his mind replaying the flight over and over. Every decision, every near disaster, every moment he'd thought they wouldn't make it. At 3:17 a.m., a doctor emerged. She was young, maybe 35, with tired eyes that had seen too many emergencies. "Are you the pilot?" she asked Bobby. He stood. "Yes. How is she?" "Alive. Because of you." The doctor managed a small smile. "When she arrived, her organs were shutting down. Another 30 minutes and we wouldn't have been able to save her. But we got antibiotics into her immediately, and she's responding. She's stable now." Bobby felt his knees go weak. Frank caught his arm, steadying him. "Can I see her?" Bobby asked. "Her mother's with her now, but yes, I think she'd like to thank you." The doctor led Bobby down a corridor to a private room. Inside, Janet Mallory sat beside Emma's bed, holding her daughter's hand. Emma was asleep, hooked up to monitors and IVs, but her color was better. She was breathing easier. Janet looked up when Bobby entered. Her eyes were red from crying, but she was smiling. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, standing. "They told me you haven't flown in 25 years, that you came out of retirement to save my daughter." Bobby didn't know what to say. I just did what needed to be done." "No." Janet walked over and took both his hands in hers. "You risked your life. In a storm that grounded every professional pilot in the state, you flew an ancient plane through mountains in the dark to save a little girl you'd never met." Her voice broke. "Why? Why would you do that?" Bobby looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully. He saw Katie's face superimposed over hers. "Because 25 years ago, I made a mistake that cost my family their lives," Bobby said quietly. "My wife and 2 children died in a plane crash. I was the pilot. I made the call to fly in bad weather and they died because of it." Janet's expression shifted to understanding and compassion. "I swore I'd never fly again," Bobby continued. "I blamed the sky, the plane, myself. But tonight when I heard your voice on the radio begging for help, I couldn't let another child die. Not if there was something I could do about it." "I'm so sorry for your loss," Janet said. "But what you did tonight, you honored their memory, you saved my daughter's life." Bobby's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in 25 years, he let himself cry, really cry, for everything he'd lost. Janet hugged him, and they stood there for a long moment. 2 strangers connected by tragedy and redemption. A small voice broke the silence. "Mommy?" They turned. Emma's eyes were open, looking around groggily. "Baby!" Janet rushed to her side. "Oh, baby, you're awake." "Where am I?" Emma asked weakly. "You're in the hospital, sweetheart. You were very sick, but you're going to be okay now." Emma's eyes found Bobby standing by the door. "Who's that?" Janet smiled through her tears. "That's Mr. Caldwell. He's a pilot. He flew through a terrible storm to bring you here and save your life." Emma looked at Bobby with wide, wondering eyes. "Like a superhero?" Bobby chuckled despite his tears. "No, sweetheart, just a pilot." "Thank you," Emma whispered. Then her eyes closed again, exhausted. Bobby left the room and found Frank waiting in the hall. His friend stood immediately. "How is she?" "She's going to make it." Frank grinned. "Then it was worth it." Every terrifying second of that flight was worth it. They walked out of the hospital together as dawn was breaking. The storm had finally passed, leaving Kalispell blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled in the early light. The world looked clean, new, reborn. Bobby's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Hello? Mr. Caldwell. This is David Harrison from the Montana Standard. I'm a reporter. I heard about your flight last night, and I'd like to do a story. A pilot who hasn't flown in 25 years making a heroic rescue flight through the worst storm of the year. Our readers would love to hear about it." Bobby's first instinct was to refuse. He didn't want attention. He didn't want to be called a hero. But then he thought about Emma, fighting for her life because someone had been willing to act. He thought about all the other remote families who might face similar emergencies. "Okay," Bobby said. "I'll talk to you." The story ran 3 days later on the front page of the Montana Standard. Retired pilot breaks 25-year vow to save dying child. Bobby's photo was there, him standing beside the Cessna, looking tired but determined. The article told the whole story: his family's death, his self-imposed exile from flying, the desperate midnight flight through the storm. By noon, Bobby's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Other newspapers wanted interviews. Local TV stations showed up at his repair shop. Someone had posted the story on social media, and it was spreading. "Local hero proves it's never too late for redemption. Pilot's 25-year penance ends with life-saving flight. The man who conquered his demons to save a stranger." Bobby hated the attention, but something unexpected was happening. People were reaching out, not just reporters, but other people. A woman from Billings called to thank him. Her brother had been saved by a bush pilot 15 years ago when he'd had a heart attack at a remote hunting camp. Bobby's story reminded her why bush pilots mattered. A retired military pilot wrote a letter saying Bobby had inspired him to start flying again after a traumatic crash had grounded him mentally for years. Families from remote areas sent emails thanking him for proving that someone still cared about isolated communities. 1 week after the flight, Bobby received a visitor at his shop, a man in his 40s dressed in a suit carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm James Patterson from the Montana Rural Aviation Initiative. May I have a moment of your time?" Bobby wiped his hands on a rag and invited him in. I'll get straight to the point, Patterson said. Montana has a critical shortage of bush pilots willing to serve remote communities. The old generation is retiring, and young pilots prefer commercial aviation. When emergencies happen, like Emma Mallory, we often have no one to respond. He pulled out documents from his briefcase. We'd like to offer you a contract. We need experienced pilots for emergency medical flights, supply runs to isolated areas, search and rescue operations. The pay is modest, but we'd cover all your aircraft maintenance, insurance, fuel costs, and get you fully certified again. Bobby stared at the papers. You want me to fly professionally? I'm 58 years old. I haven't had a valid license in 25 years. You're experienced, you're capable, and you've proven you have the courage to fly when it matters most. We can fast-track your certification. What do you say? Bobby thought about the Cessna sitting in the hangar. After the flight, he and Frank had inspected her thoroughly. She needed work, a complete overhaul, really, but she was sound. She'd carried them through hell and brought them home. Can I think about it? Bobby asked. Of course. Take your time. After Patterson left, Bobby walked to the hangar. The Cessna was inside, covered with a new tarp. But this time the sight didn't fill him with dread. His phone rang. It was Janet Mallory. Bobby? I hope I'm not bothering you. Not at all. How's Emma? She's home. The doctors released her yesterday. She's weak, but she's going to make a full recovery. Bobby, I'm calling because Tom and I want you to come to dinner. This Saturday, if you're free. Emma wants to meet the pilot who saved her properly. Bobby smiled. I'd like that. Saturday came. Bobby drove the 80 miles to Timber Creek, this time in daylight on clear roads. The mountains that had been invisible in the storm were magnificent in the sun, towering peaks of rock and snow that stretched to the horizon. The Mallory home was small but warm, filled with the smell of home cooking. Emma met him at the door, still pale but smiling, wearing her I Survived t-shirt that her parents had made for her. Mr. Caldwell, she hugged his legs, thank you for saving me. Bobby knelt down to her level. You're very welcome, Emma. How are you feeling? Much better. The doctors said I can go back to school next week, and guess what? I want to be a pilot when I grow up, just like you. Bobby's heart squeezed. He looked up at Janet and Tom, who were smiling with tears in their eyes. Over dinner, they talked and laughed. Emma told Bobby about her school, her friends, her pet rabbit. It was normal, comfortable, healing. As Bobby prepared to leave, Tom pulled him aside. We heard about the job offer from the Rural Aviation Initiative, Tom said. I hope you take it. Montana needs pilots like you, people like us, living in remote places. We depend on pilots. You saved our daughter's life. You could save others. Driving home that night, Bobby thought about Tom's words. He thought about Emma wanting to be a pilot. He thought about Katie, who'd had the same dream. When he got home, he didn't go to his cabin. He went to the hangar. He opened the door, turned on the lights, and pulled off the tarp. The Cessna sat there, battered but noble. She'd carried him through the storm and brought him back to life. Bobby opened the pilot's door and sat in the seat. He placed his hands on the yoke. And for the first time in 25 years, it felt right. He picked up his phone and called James Patterson. Mr. Patterson, this is Bobby Caldwell. About that job offer. I accept. The certification process was intense. Bobby spent 6 weeks relearning everything he'd once known. Flight regulations had changed. Technology had advanced. His skills were rusty, but his instructor, a woman named Carol Martinez, saw something in him that others might have missed. You fly with your heart as much as your hands, she told him, after a particularly difficult training session. Most pilots today rely too much on instruments. But you feel the plane. That's rare. Bobby worked harder than he'd worked at anything in decades. He flew training missions in all conditions, relearned emergency procedures, passed written tests and practical exams. The muscle memory was still there, buried under 25 years of rust, but returning. During this time, the Cessna underwent her own transformation. With funding from the Rural Aviation Initiative, Bobby completely overhauled her. New engine, new avionics, fresh paint. She emerged looking like she'd been born yesterday, while still carrying the soul of her long history. On the day Bobby received his renewed pilot's license, Frank threw him a small celebration at the repair shop. "Speech!" someone called out. Bobby stood awkwardly, not used to being the center of attention. I don't really have a speech prepared. I just want to say thank you. To Frank for believing in me. To Carol for teaching me. To all of you for supporting me." He paused, emotional. 25 years ago, I lost everything that mattered. And I blamed myself, blamed flying, blamed the sky. But that night with Emma, I learned something. The sky didn't take my family from me. My fear and pride did. I made a bad decision and I've carried that guilt ever since. But flying isn't what killed them. Flying is what saved Emma. And flying is what's giving me a second chance at life. So thank you all of you for helping me find my way back. The small crowd applauded. Bobby saw tears on several faces. His first official mission came 2 weeks later. A rancher in the remote Beartooth Mountains had broken his leg. Road access was impossible due to early snow. Bobby flew out alone, landed on a rough airstrip, loaded the injured man, and flew him to the hospital in Billings. The mission went flawlessly. Bobby felt alive in a way he hadn't in decades. More missions followed. Supply runs to isolated communities, medical evacuations, search and rescue operations. Bobby flew almost every day, each flight building his confidence, healing old wounds. One evening, 3 months after Emma's rescue, Bobby sat in his cabin going through old boxes he'd kept sealed for years. Inside were photos of Margaret, Katie, and Michael, pictures he hadn't been able to look at for 2 decades. Now he could. He spread them out on the table, looking at his wife's smile, his children's faces. The pain was still there, but it was different now. Softer, more like remembrance than torture. "I'm flying again," he said aloud to the photos. "I think you'd be happy about that. I think you'd be proud of what I'm doing." His phone rang. It was dispatch. "Bobby, we've got an emergency. Pregnant woman in preterm labor at Fort Smith needs immediate transport to Billings. Weather's marginal but flyable. Can you take it?" Bobby looked at the photos one more time, then at the window where his Cessna waited in the hangar. "I'm on my way," he said. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. Not running from his past anymore. Running toward his future. 6 months after Emma's rescue, Bobby had flown over 100 missions. He'd saved 17 lives, delivered medical supplies to countless remote families, and become a fixture in Montana's rural aviation community. But he still carried ghosts. Some nights, he'd wake up in a cold sweat, reliving that December day in 1999. He'd see Margaret's plane going down, hear the impact, feel the crushing weight of responsibility. His therapist, yes, he was seeing a therapist now, told him it was normal. Trauma doesn't just disappear, Bobby, but you're facing it. That's what matters. One crisp October morning, Bobby received an unusual request. A family wanted to charter his plane for a memorial flight. They wanted to scatter their grandfather's ashes over Cathedral Peak, the same mountain where Bobby's family had died. Bobby's first instinct was to refuse, but something made him accept. The family was named Morrison, no relation to Frank. They were kind people, respectful of Bobby's obvious discomfort. As they flew toward Cathedral Peak, Bobby found himself telling them his story, about Margaret, Katie, and Michael, about the crash, about 25 years of grief. Mr. Morrison, the deceased man's son, listened carefully. "My father was a pilot too," he said. "Flew in World War II. He always said that the sky doesn't discriminate. It'll kill the careless and spare the careful, but sometimes it takes good people doing everything right. That's not anyone's fault. That's just life." They reached Cathedral Peak. Bobby circled the summit while the family scattered the ashes. As he flew, Bobby looked down at the mountain slope where his family had died. For the first time, he didn't feel crushing guilt. He felt peace. "Thank you," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to the family, his own family, or the mountain itself. "Thank you for everything." After landing, Mr. Morrison shook Bobby's hand. "You've given us a beautiful memory today. I hope we've given you something too." They had. That evening, Bobby drove to the cemetery. He hadn't been in months. His healing had taken him away from the constant graveside visits. He stood before the 3 headstones, the setting sun painting the mountains gold. "I'm okay now," he told them. "It took 25 years, but I'm okay. I'm flying again. I'm helping people. I think I'm living the life you'd want me to live." A breeze rustled through the pines, and Bobby chose to believe it was them answering. He placed flowers on each grave and turned to leave. As he walked away, his phone rang. It was Emma Mallory. "Mr. Caldwell, it's Emma. Guess what? My mom signed me up for Young Eagles. It's a program where kids get to fly in planes. My first flight is next month, and I'm so excited. Will you come watch?" Bobby smiled, tears in his eyes. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Emma." And Mr. Caldwell, thank you again for saving my life. My teacher said I should tell you that you're my hero. Emma, you helped save my life too. You just don't know it yet." After hanging up, Bobby stood in the cemetery parking lot looking at the sky. Clear, vast, infinite. He wasn't afraid of it anymore. Bobby's success with the Rural Aviation Initiative attracted attention from other states. Wyoming, Idaho, and North Dakota all had similar problems: remote communities, pilot shortages, and no one to respond to emergencies. James Patterson approached Bobby with a proposal. "We want to expand the program, train a new generation of bush pilots specifically for remote emergency response. And Bobby, we want you to lead the training program." "Me? I'm just a pilot. I'm not a teacher." "You're exactly what we need. You understand the reality of bush flying, the danger, the responsibility, the weight of lives depending on you. You've lived the consequences of mistakes. You're the perfect person to train others." Bobby thought about it for a week. Then he said yes. The Montana Bush Pilot Academy opened in the spring. 10 students ranging from 22 to 50 years old. Some were experienced pilots looking to specialize. Others were starting from scratch. Bobby was nervous on the first day. He stood before the class, looking at eager faces, wondering what he could possibly teach them. Then he thought about Emma, about Margaret, about all the flights that had brought him to this moment. "My name is Bobby Caldwell," he began. 25 years ago, I made a decision that killed my family. I'm going to tell you that story, not because I want sympathy, but because I want you to understand something fundamental about bush flying. Every decision has consequences, and people's lives depend on you getting it right." He told them everything. The crash, the guilt, the 25 years of self-exile, Emma's rescue, his redemption. The room was silent when he finished. "I'm not going to teach you how to be heroes," Bobby continued. "I'm going to teach you how to be responsible, how to make good decisions under pressure, how to know when to fly and when to stay grounded, because the sky is beautiful and dangerous, and it doesn't care about your intentions." The training program was rigorous. Bobby pushed his students hard, harder than Carol had pushed him. He taught them not just flying skills, but judgment, wisdom, caution tempered with courage. One student, a 24-year-old named Alex Chen, reminded Bobby of himself at that age, confident, skilled, but slightly reckless. After Alex hot-dogged during a training exercise, Bobby pulled him aside. "Do you know why I grounded you just now?" Bobby asked. "It was perfectly safe." "It wasn't. You had a passenger in the back. That unnecessary maneuver put them at risk. In bush flying, you're not just responsible for yourself. You're responsible for everyone who trusts you." Bobby's voice softened. "I was like you once, confident, maybe overconfident, and one day that confidence killed 3 people I loved more than life itself. Learn from my mistake, Alex. Don't make your own." Alex's attitude changed after that. He became careful, thoughtful, constantly assessing risks. At the end of the 6-month program, all 10 students passed. Bobby stood before them at graduation. "You're not just pilots now," he told them. "You're guardians. People in remote places are going to depend on you. Be worthy of that trust." Emma Mallory, now 10 years old, was there for the graduation. She'd become something of a mascot for the program, the girl whose life had started it all. She presented Bobby with a gift, a photograph of herself beside his Cessna, holding a sign that read, "Thank you for giving me wings." Bobby hugged her, unable to speak. After the ceremony, Frank approached Bobby. "You've built something amazing here. Margaret would be proud. Katie would be proud." "I hope so," Bobby said. "I really hope so." 1 year after Emma's rescue, Bobby stood in his hangar looking at his Cessna. She'd flown over 500 missions now, saved 43 lives, and had become famous in her own right. The rescue bird, people called her. But tonight, Bobby had a special flight planned. Emma and her family were coming to Whitefish for a celebration, the 1-year anniversary of the flight that saved her life. Emma had asked Bobby for something special. She wanted to go flying with him. "Are you sure about this?" Janet had asked Bobby on the phone. "After everything that happened?" "I'm sure," Bobby had replied. "Trust me." Now, as the Mallory family arrived at the hangar, Emma ran ahead, her eyes wide with excitement. "Can I really fly with you, Mr. Caldwell?" "You really can, Emma, but first I need to teach you some things about being a pilot." Bobby spent an hour showing Emma the plane, explaining how everything worked, teaching her the pre-flight checklist. She absorbed every word, asking intelligent questions. "Okay," Bobby finally said. Ready to go up? Emma's eyes lit up like stars. They climbed into the Cessna, Emma in the right seat, Bobby in the left. Janet and Tom watched nervously from the ground. Bobby went through his checklist, then started the engine. Emma giggled with delight as the propeller came to life. They taxied to the runway and took off smoothly into a perfect Montana evening. The sky was clear, the air calm. The mountains glowed golden in the setting sun. "This is amazing," Emma shouted over the engine noise. "Is this what you felt like when you were my age?" "Yes," Bobby said, smiling. "This is exactly what I felt like." He let Emma hold the yoke, guiding her hands, teaching her how to feel the plane's movements. "Mr. Caldwell," Emma said after a while, "my mom told me about your family, about how they died in a plane crash. I'm really sorry." Bobby was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Emma. Is that why you stopped flying? Because you were scared?" "Yes, and because I blamed myself. But it wasn't your fault, was it?" "Mom said it was bad weather." Bobby thought about that question. It was the question he'd asked himself 10,000 times. "I made decisions that led to their death," Bobby said carefully. "But I've learned something over this past year. I can't change the past. All I can do is try to make the present better. That's why I fly now, to help people, to save lives, to honor my family by living the way they'd want me to live." Emma was quiet, processing. Then she said, "I think they'd be really proud of you." Bobby felt tears sting his eyes. "I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so." They flew for another 30 minutes, circling over Whitefish Lake, following the Flathead River, soaring past the peaks of Glacier National Park in the distance. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Bobby pointed to Cathedral Peak. "That's where they died," he said quietly. "For 25 years, I couldn't even look at that mountain without feeling pain. But now I see it differently. Yes, it's where I lost them, but it's also a reminder of how precious life is, how important it is to live fully while we can." Emma reached over and squeezed his hand. They turned for home, landing just as darkness fell. Janet and Tom rushed over as they climbed out, hugging Emma tightly. "How was it?" Janet asked. "It was perfect," Emma said. "Mom, Dad, I'm definitely going to be a pilot when I grow up, just like Mr. Caldwell." Bobby smiled. "Then I'll be here to teach you when you're ready." That night, after the Mallorys had gone to their hotel, Bobby returned to the hangar one last time. He walked to the Cessna and placed his hand on her fuselage. "Thank you," he said to the plane. "Thank you for carrying me through that storm. Thank you for giving me my life back." He thought about the promise he'd made 25 years ago. Never again. Never the sky. Never. He'd broken that promise. And in breaking it, he'd discovered something profound. Some promises need to be broken. Some fears need to be faced. Some wounds need to be opened before they can truly heal. Bobby looked at Katie's photo, still taped to the dashboard after all these years. "I'm flying again, Katie Bug," he whispered. "And I think I'm happy. Is that okay? Is it okay for me to be happy?" In his heart he heard her voice clear as a bell. "Of course it's okay, Daddy. We want you to be happy. We want you to fly." Bobby smiled through his tears, turned off the hangar lights, and walked home under a sky full of stars. The next morning, dispatch called with another emergency. A stranded hiker in the wilderness, injured and alone. Bobby grabbed his jacket and headed for the hangar. He was a pilot again. And this time, he was flying not away from his past but toward his future.